Say them again.
So we have density, sort of sprawl, and affordability, right? And sort of the idea is that like you can't have like if you want to like, contain sprawl and you want to have low density, you've made your choice about the third thing, right? Like, you know. I think that we would all like expressively say that we want to live, not everyone would use the word dynamic, but like a prosperous society. And I think like housing is just like a fundamental input into that. If you start caring about a lot of other stuff like in this area, like, you know, in particular, like what you are allowed or what your neighbor is not allowed to do with their housing, I think you start to sort of stand in the way of like that prosperity.
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for our 8th episode, I sat down with Taylor Jaworski in his office at the University of Colorado, where he is a research faculty. Taylor is an economist who studies regional economics and is passionate about what makes cities work. Our conversation ranged across topics including what's so great about cities, why is housing expensive, collective action in the context of incumbents and newcomers, tax policy, whether Boulder residents are uniquely greedy, dynamism, diversity, radical markets, and more. Taylor tends to wave his hands around while speaking in generalities, but when I really pinned him down on what policy changes he would make in Boulder, he singled out exclusionary zoning, occupancy restrictions, and NIMBY attitudes more generally as being important impediments to having the kind of dynamic city he wants to live in. A book that Taylor recommended to me about a year ago quotes the famous economist John Maynard Keynes as saying the following: "The ideas of economists, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." Taylor is no defunct economist. He is brimming with energy and ideas and is passionate about seeing Boulder become a prosperous and diverse city. And I think that is totally funked. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Taylor Jaworski. Taylor, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today.
Yep.
Just go ahead and introduce yourself.
So my name is Taylor Jaworski. I'm an economist, economic historian at the University of Colorado, Boulder. My research and teaching focus on economic history, focused on regional development in the 20th century in the United States. So.
Regional development meaning like that's the unit of measure.
So to kind of think, so we can think sort of in aggregate terms about countries and, you know, why some countries are rich versus poor, but then we can apply sort of some of those tools to understanding within a country why different regions are rich and poor, where some of the ideas that, you know, we would apply to countries apply, but then, you know, countries have a feature of, you know, where the regions are a lot more integrated because, you know, they share the same government or they share many of the same governments, the same structure of government, you know, federal, state, local. You know, they get to benefit all from the same, you know, highway infrastructure, which is the focus of some of my research. But then, you know, other things like, you know, they share the same language. But then, you know, we look within the United States and there still are big differences. You know, it's not like the U.S. is one point in space and everyone is, you know, has the same, you know, standard of living in the U.S. And so just as we want to understand why the U.S. and Europe and other parts of the world have different standards of living, we might want to understand that same question, you know, applied to regions within the U.S.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So we've spoken a couple times.
Yep.
And had both were kind of long, wandering conversations. I really enjoyed talking with you. But the thing that really comes clear is like you're super passionate about cities and what makes cities important. Like what's so great about cities?
Yeah. So I mean, I think So I'm an economist, and so I've read a lot of the research on cities, and then I've read a lot of sort of like the kind of the pop presentations of research. And so one of my favorite books is Ed Glazer's Triumph of the Cities, and in that book he says something like cities are one of mankind's greatest inventions, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean, it certainly does not mean that all things in cities are good, but that cities are this incredible engine of growth for societies. In today's society, it's where a lot of the economic activity is located, right? You wouldn't be able to look at a map of the U.S. and say, oh, that place is really geographically big. And so it generates a lot of economic output, right? As one way to sort of measure the standard of living, right? You would have to kind of go and say, well, there's a lot of density of economic output in a very small geography, whether you're talking about Manhattan or Palo Alto or even a place like Boulder. And so there's this incredible engine of growth and prosperity, and they are that way, I think, because they sort of do something that's fundamental to the process of growth and development, which is they facilitate the exchange of ideas. And so there's lots of work in economics on that and on how cities and facilitate the exchange of ideas. But sort of at its core, like that's what cities are good at, right? I mean, if a city can be good at something, and a kind of an ecological object like a city can be good at something, it's sort of facilitating the exchange of ideas. And so that's, I think, something that I am interested in sort of understanding, like how cities do that, but then once we understand that, sort of trying to get cities to sort of just maximize that for more people, right? So maximize the way in which they facilitate exchange for more and more people, so that more and more people can sort of be the beneficiaries of the standard of living that we have in the U.S., for example.
Well, and I totally admire that, but when I think about it, it's like I really like living in a city, right? Like for personally, like cities are fun to live in. I just think like we ought to work hard at building great places to live in, right? Because
yeah, I mean, so I definitely sort of when I started out, I emphasized sort of the what people might think of economists as emphasizing, things like output and GDP and income, but there's definitely room, and that people definitely should think about not just sort of like the monetary or pecuniary side of what cities can do for people, but also like kind of when I say something like the standard of living, I don't just mean the material standard of living. I mean in a place like Boulder, like there's some balance between that and like the amenities, right, that are available, right? And then those amenities, they're not the same everywhere, right? The amenities of Manhattan are different from the amenities of Boulder, but people sort of sort into cities based on the combination of sort of work opportunities and amenities that are there that kind of fit their preferences.
Yeah. Well, so I want so this podcast is all about housing and land use and thinking about like what's working in Boulder, but really kind of more importantly, like why is Boulder not inclusive and not affordable? So maybe just give a quick, give us the easy version of why is housing expensive?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that like in general, we can think about sort of different things that can be accomplished when it comes to housing. So affordability is one of those things, right? So we can sort of make policies that affect affordability. We can make policies that affect sort of density, right? Sort of like how many units of house we stack on top of each other. And then we can make policies about sort of how much you allow cities to expand outward, right? So the bad word would be sprawl, but that it need not always be bad if there are good reasons to do that. And so I think economists like to think about sort of kind of sets of choices that generate paradoxes or that generate sort of tension, right? And the choice between those three things is a kind of an example of this kind of like.
Say them again.
So we have density,
yeah.
sort of sprawl, and affordability, right? And sort of the idea is that like you can't sort of have like if you want to like contain sprawl, and you want to have low density, like you've made your choice about the third thing, right?
Totally.
Like once you've made your choice about those two things, or kind of once you've made your choice about two of these things, like it becomes harder to kind of think about like the other one as just being out there, able to control it, right? As you would wish.
So Boulder's worked so hard to contain sprawl, and I like the joke that there's only one thing Boulder hates more than sprawl, and that's density.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think that like Boulder, I mean, as we've talked about in one of our previous conversations, Boulder, I think, is a place that at a point in time was really innovative, I think, in thinking about how to contain sprawl and what the like value of that would be to people, right? Not just like, abstractly, like, we don't like this thing called sprawl. We have a bunch of like, highly abstract and like philosophical ideas about why sprawl is bad. Like we don't like the way it's spelled and this and that. But they, for like really practical reasons why you might want to contain sprawl. And then, right, like we do that, and then we have to think about like what the implications of that. We've sort of taken away one variable, right, that we can use, and so then we're left with one other variable, right? We're left with like the density variable to kind of move around, and like the choice that we make about that is going to determine the choice that is going to be the choice that we've also made about affordability. That isn't the only thing.
Yeah, I mean,
that's not the only way that I would frame sort of the issues around housing in Boulder. But then I think that's one kind of useful framework to think about.
So I would
these
say
issues.
I would say that what you just said is sort of like the implied free market argument. Like there's a supply demand curve. We've cut off supply pretty harshly. That's inelastic. The demand is high because we're in this middle of this engine of opportunity. So like affordability could just be fiat legislated as rent control or deed restrictions or something like that.
Yeah. I guess like, I think it's important to bring into the conversation about Boulder specifically, which is just that like, Boulder has a set of like underlying characteristics, like fundamental characteristics and things that roughly speaking we're not going to change, over like a kind of short to medium run, that are just very desirable, right? And so, while it is true that like, we can sit here and we will probably sit here today and think about ways and try to talk about ways to improve, housing policy and to make houses more affordable. Like when it comes down to it, like Boulder is just going to be an expensive place to live because it is a desirable place to live, right? And like, like it's bounded on one side by mountains. That's not really like a hard geographic constraint, right? Like, because we have so much other space that, in principle we could move if we were willing to relax. And like, I'm not sure we should want to do that. We should want to like build into open space. Like that seems like we should do that like last of all the possible options, right? Yeah. But like, Boulder, kind of regardless of whatever decision we make about that, is just going to be an expensive place to live because people want to be here and they want to be close to the mountains, right? Yeah. And so like, I think it's useful to recognize that like, we're working in an environment in which like, Boulder is just not going to be some other place that doesn't have the natural amenities that it has. And it has these, and we're going to have to live with the fact that it's desirable to a lot of people, right? When they discover them, they want to move here.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be too narrow focused on affordability. Like I think there's lots of good reasons to change land use and housing policy besides affordability, like climate change, having walkable neighborhoods, not having to drive everywhere, diversity and inclusion, and like community health, like mental health, connectedness to others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, affordability, like, we can try to affect that. I think in the end, it's not going to be something that like, we are going to dramatically change to sort of, cut the median house price of in Boulder by half. Like I think that's probably not in the cards, over kind of over a couple decade period. I mean, like we can make it more affordable, sort of like in an economist phrase, like on the margin by like changing things. But I don't think that we're gonna uncover some policy that people hadn't uncovered that will make houses radically more affordable. Like I think we can do things and we should try to do things. Yeah. But I don't think that we're sort of at the end of that tunnel is like a house for everyone.
I don't see any path where like single family homes as they're currently configured, those start depreciating somehow because some magic policy. I mean, that seems crazy to me, unless there was some massive collapse in demand, which would be catastrophic.
Be bad in other ways.
Lots of other ways.
Yeah.
But I mean, to me, it seems like you could turn lots of houses into duplexes, and then presumably those two houses wouldn't be as expensive as the house that it replaced.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of our previous conversations, right? So like land is the scarce good in this, right? And so we have to figure out how to use that scarce good to produce the things that we want, the commodities, right? The housing units that we want, and so we can do that, and we can talk about policies to do that. And like I think those policies would be to the benefit of many people. I mean, I think before like jumping to affordability, I think affordability is important for accomplishing some of the other goals, things like diversity, right? That you mentioned. But like I would just start by saying that I think we should have policies that like underlie a dynamic society and policies that or a dynamic community, right? Because we're not talking about like the U.S. as a whole. We're talking about like a single community, but like a dynamic community. And I think those are policies that allow for a mix of like sort of incumbents to play an important role in the community, but also for newcomers to play an important role in the community. And I think that like Boulder is a place that I'm not super involved in like politics or kind of local activism, but it seems or it feels like a place where incumbents, right, whether they be incumbent maybe business owners or certainly like incumbent homeowners, like have a big say in the direction that things go. And like there's a lot of good reasons for that, but there's like a mix of sort of sort of having incumbents play an important role and having newcomers or other types of constituents. Renters would be the kind of the obvious other one, but like you can think about other groups, people who commute in who want to benefit from the amenities, and we should have a society or have a community, a set of policies in this community that can help sort of support that kind of dynamism, which I think like people do want, right? Like people live in Boulder in part because it's a college town. It has kind of a young feel to it. The college town atmosphere like generates a lot of amenities that people enjoy, whether or not they particularly always enjoy like the students and the student life. That kind of goes back and forth. But like I think people enjoy living in a college town, and so we should sort of think about like the inputs into like the best characteristics that produce that, and then sort of try to enhance those characteristics.
Yeah. So one way I've that was an interesting way that you phrased that, because one way I've framed the incumbents sort of versus the newcomers is in terms of political power asymmetry, right? So like in the way you can really ground this is like, okay, someone wants to develop this block and completely reconfigure, add a bunch of housing or add some dense offices or something like that. And the people who think they're going to be negatively affected by it, they know exactly who they are, right? They're all the neighbors that, and they've identified themselves. But the new tenants and the new residents and all the people that would benefit from that development, they're kind of scattered about. They don't know who they are, and so there's just kind of naturally this power imbalance between the people who are established and the people who would like to join in.
Yeah, I mean, in economics, there's a thing called sort of a collective action problem, and it's in other fields too. And one of the issues that arises in sort of trying to resolve collective action problems is that in many cases we can sort of think about the benefits of some policy as being concentrated. and the costs being diffuse. And
so
your example just now is an example of such a policy, right? Like people know that they benefit from like the people in a particular area know that like I like it here, and like I don't like the change that you're proposing would definitely make this worse, like for me.
Perhaps. People always give worst case scenarios.
Yeah, people have like in their mind, right? Like whether it's like always true as they state it may not be, but then like the costs, right, that they are imagining that are out there, like people are willing to recognize, like there's benefits to me and there's going to be costs to other people, but those costs are diffuse over many potential people who might decide to live in Boulder, right, or move closer or whatever.
So I have a theme that I feel like is more that's a huge theme, but I have one that I really want to make sure we cover in depth, because this is actually really a question that got me excited about this whole, I like anybody who comes to town, you start looking around like, hey, this is pretty nice, and then you start looking at housing prices, you're like, oh my God, this place is expensive. It's sort of like, is it really that expensive? You look at some of the little 1,000 square foot bungalows and you're like, wow, that's a pretty, sticker shock,
Yeah.
So one of the questions that I have is like, markets are supposed to allocate goods and services, resources, efficiently, right? And when I look around Boulder, I see so much inefficiency of land use, like the way vacant lots stay empty year after year, the way large houses are on large lots, or small houses on large lots, where the yards are like essentially neglected. It's just like a brown field of neglected grass. And it's like, to me, it seems like if you had like an efficient market or like a healthy market, we would allocate the land way differently than we actually do. So can you maybe like talk about?
Yeah, I think that like we have like a, I don't know, like efficient, but we have a pretty active market for like the sale of land. In Boulder, I think like that is true, and that's true like in lots of places, like all over the country. Like, virtually everywhere, right? But I think that like we shouldn't think about like the market for land as being one of like a market free of distortions, right? So like kind of on top of anything that Boulder decides to do, right, is just the fact that like we have like a tax code, right, that treats certain kinds of capital gains derived from real estate differently, right? Yeah. And again, like that might be an attempt to do something that is like admirable, right? To encourage people to make investments in the housing stock.
And just to be clear, those tax policies that you're talking about favor buying and owning housing.
Yeah, they do, and then they try to like the 1031 exchange of in the tax code that allows you to kind of say take a house that you are not living in and exchange that house for another house that you find more attractive for whatever reason as a say as a property owner who's going to maybe rent it out. That gets treated differently in the tax system than somebody just buying and selling a house. But then even somebody doing that, right, enjoys some kind of relief on the capital gains tax if it's their primary residence up to some amount. And so like there's that stuff that like there's already interventions like just there's just interventions at the federal level in sort of every single transaction that goes on. And then like within a given community there are just
hang on before you move from that. So that those federal interventions, because you were talking about this in the context of distorting the way prices are, or the way the market is efficient, perhaps. So would you say those federal interventions generally distort the market in like which like in which way? I guess?
It can be hard to tell. It might drive prices up, right? So it might mean that prices are higher, or it just might mean that like the piece of land and the house on it, or the thing on it, the structure on it, is not allocated to the person who is making best use of that. right? So there's kind of potential inefficiency in that, like, the price is sort of like maybe too low or too high based on some policies, or that like just the unit of land is not being matched to the person who is going to make the best and highest use of it, right? And so there's that stuff at the federal level, and then at the local level, there's all kinds of things, that of communities sort of trying to micromanage, like how different places within the community, or like neighborhoods within the community, are used, right, through zoning, right, industrial versus residential, and then within residential, certain kinds of residential, and then just like lots of kind of smaller things, right, like I bought a house in Boulder a couple years ago, and like we had to go and like if the potential neighbor was going to do something to their house, like how would it affect our view, or our the shadow on our property. And then you have recourse, like at the city, you can go and say like, hey, they're going to do this thing that casts a different shadow
blocks
on my
solar panels.
Yeah, and then you can go and say like that person can't do that with their property, right? And like this is not me saying that like that particular rule is bad, right? There might be good reason to have those kinds of rules, but we have a lot of those rules, right?
Lots of them.
And so once you start having those rules, it becomes sort of hard to believe that like affordability is your number one concern, right? Like, you have all those rules, and you have them for good reasons, but the reasons that you have them are not affordability. They're for some other reason. They might be safety. They might be, whatever.
When you kind of back up and look at the collection of rules that we have, it sort of speaks volumes that what we really care about is protecting the sanctity of single-family homes on large lots.
Yeah, I mean, whether that is like the expressed preference of any particular person, whether they be like a resident, like an incumbent, as I called them, or like a politician representing those people, like whether that would be the expressed preference or like way that person would state it, like that is like what is happening, right? Like it's not like maybe like what the preference is of a particular person, right? They would wish it to be different if they could just wish things, but like we can't do that, so we have to like make policies and then understand how all those things, all the policies we make interact with like the facts on the ground, and like that interaction in Boulder, I think tends to produce houses that would otherwise be cheaper but are more expensive.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a related question that sort of builds on what we've been talking about, and that is, I think when people think about the distortions of all of these rules that we have on the housing market, people, in my experience, kind of fall into two camps. If you're a liberal, you tend to think, the distortions are caused by the free market forces that promote greed and exponential growth, and and then if you're a conservative, you're like, well, the distortions are caused by all these regulations that we put on to like supply, for example. Like we've all these regulations, to me, they seem to add up to like we're going to have as little new supply as possible, right? And so that becomes inelastic, and that's what's distorting the market. So is it like one side's wrong? Are they both right in their own kind of way?
I mean, I think it's hard to believe that what the problem is with a particular place like Boulder is a kind of emotion, like, or a kind of characteristic of a person like greed, right? Because like I don't particularly think that is a characteristic that like varies a lot across geography, right? Like it's it's like
or ethnicities.
Yeah, there's Iowa, there's Arkansas, there's Colorado, and then within all those places there's different communities, and I wouldn't say that like the thing that makes those places really really different is a characteristic like greed.
Yeah, like there's somehow special that it's like way more greedy than.
Yeah, I think that like what makes those places different is the kind of like the combination of amenities and work opportunities that attract different people to different places, right? And then on top of that, you get those people, like over time, produce demand for, I mean, I'm sort of trying to be like in the middle, right?
Is that like, where you are? Are you in the middle? Or are you just trying to sound that way?
I'm trying to be in the middle for this, which and just to like.
Well, but we're not. I'm not an independent journalist here. You can like be as opinionated as you want here. Please do.
I mean, I think that like a half century of like or more of pretty substantial interventions in housing markets in big and small ways have been a disaster for people who want to live in suitable housing arrangements. I don't think that's like a problem particularly of like big government. It's just a problem of kind of like the accumulation of small decisions made on a local level. I mean, again, I want to emphasize sometimes with very good reasons, but that like have just disastrously raised the housing costs in the places that are the most productive places in the country.
So when you say that,
and Boulder is like a small, Boulder is kind of like a small, like it's not the most important example of this, but it is an example of a place that is extremely desirable to live for any number of reasons, both work and amenities. Yeah. And it is a place that is like disastrously expensive for the people who want to live and enjoy the amenities and work opportunities here. Either they can't do those things, or to do those things they have to get in their car and drive. Yeah. And like, I mean, I think that like, you know, driving doesn't make people happy. Like there's research that shows that, and like we should embrace that and say like we want to like make people happy, and like they should be able to afford where they live and not have to drive to do it.
Yeah. You had said something about how the accumulation of all these policies has been disastrous, and to affordability for one. And when you say that, I just hear like this kind of single focused protection of single family zoning. That's the lens I hear that statement through, and I can't help but just like interpret it that way. So is that kind of what you had in mind, or?
I mean, I think that we're starting to see in not in Boulder, but in other places. Although I think Colorado is the kind of state where you could imagine things like sort of legislation at the state level that would sort of change sort of at the state level people's attitude towards single family housing. I don't think like the locus of support for that will be Boulder, but you know we saw that kind of recently, I think in Minnesota, but then also in Oregon, sort of trying to sort of think about ways to, in a broad way at the state level, kind of tackle the problem of affordability, where. Yeah. Sort of like single family housing is trying to sort of like, you know, like equate like the piece of land with like the commodity that you want to like sell, right? Which is like the house, right? You want to like have more houses, and like like land is scarce, but like, you know, like houses, like we have all kinds of special ways and creative ways to build those, right? Like it's not like the idea of a house isn't expensive, right? Like you can just like go on Zillow and other perfectly fine places to live across the country and note that like, you know, nice houses can be affordable.
Well, Omaha, Nebraska is an example of a city I drive through a lot, and I go through the downtown and I'm like, hey, this city looks pretty nice, you know, but you go onto Zillow and you find the same 1,000 square foot bungalow as you would find in South Boulder, and it's like, I mean, it's clearly not the house that's for sale here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like. I kind of sometimes I think I sound like a sort of like I can sound like, you know, like a very like I'm an economist, so that must mean that like, you know, on average I'm like way more market oriented than like, you know, like the person you would like pull off of the street, which is probably true, and that like I, you know, maybe even among economists I'm particularly focused on like sort of something like economic growth, and sort of like getting as many people to share in the benefits of that as possible, and that like then seeing sort of like the issue of like affordability and housing as sort of like a key input into that. And like I don't want to come off as like, you know, sort of like unnuanced in the sense that like I don't recognize that there are other things out there. It's just that like I think that, you know, we only have like, you know, as a a person or as a society so much bandwidth to like care about things like collectively, right? And like there are that's reasonable, right? And so then I think we have to try to like be like efficient in terms of how we like direct our attention to the issues that are most important for both raising the standard of living, but then like exactly along with that, making sure that more and more people like enjoy like that higher standard of living, which like we are not and have not always been particularly good at. I don't want to necessarily think about like this as like as an equity issue, but like let's just like make housing more affordable, and like that it is an equity issue, right? Because like if you make like houses more affordable, that means that people for whom housing is a larger fraction of their budget, like it's more important for them to have that like number like in their budget go down, right? Totally. Like sort of you could think about like high housing prices as a kind of like as inducing a kind of like regressive effect on like people for whom housing is a big fraction of how they spend their money, because their incomes are lower than some other people, right? And like, so I am not like, as a kind of person who sort of sees the whole world or who tries to see the whole world, only focused or I can imagine other things that matter, but like stubbornly I want to be sort of focused in sort of like the policy space on something that I think will have a big effect on a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the caricature of economists is that they all graduated from the University of Chicago, and they consider healthy markets to be free markets, and they just whatever you can do to like grease the wheels. But I mean, like one thing that I think about with respect to markets, they're super powerful forces that like you're either working against or you're trying to work with, and like markets can be regulated and be. And just because you change the market doesn't mean it. I mean, I guess it is a distortion, but it's such a negative connotation. But I mean, you can guide markets, and we always do, right? To kind of try to make them work for us.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like there are other places, like other sectors of the economy, other parts of economics where there is more disagreement about. Where there is considerable disagreement about sort of the right approach to policy, like the right sort of theoretical framework to sort of view some set of events through like a particular like a crisis, right? Like monetary policy or fiscal policy, like that is like, so you can find those disagreements. I don't particularly think that like housing is like a place where you find like that like vast disagreement among economists. Like economists who come at other problems
in the sense of like we understand how it works and what the problems are, or like in the sense of like we've got this tool bag of solutions.
I mean, maybe the way that I would put it is that like economists who would have very different views on other issues of the day, right? Not that they have the same view, they're still like there are still differences, but like there tends to be more thinking that like the issue of housing and like sort of the economics of housing, they sort of tend to use like a roughly similar theoretical framework. There's not a big disagreement about that. I mean, there can be some disagreement, but there's not a big disagreement. And then like kind of like the public policies, again, like there might be variation around the edges, but like you have people like Ed Glazer, and then you have not necessarily on the other end of the spectrum, but like people like Enrico Moretti, and like and they have like pretty similar views on. I mean, I don't want to like put words in their mouth, but like the combination of their research sort of kind of I think points us in a similar direction. And so I think like on the issue of kind of the proper conduct of monetary policy, like you can find lots of disagreement, right? Like what the Fed should be doing or what the federal government should be doing. But on the issue of housing policy, like there's going to be differences about like kind of the rank order of like how we should approach kind of different priorities. But like that housing is too expensive, and that there are kind of like a couple of policies that like lots of people can agree on. Like I think
Okay,
like there's a lot of consensus.
Let's get to those. What are a couple of those policies?
I mean, I think that like single family, getting rid of single family zoning. I don't. So I think
we like to call it exclusionary zoning on this podcast.
Okay.
This is sharing Boulder after all.
So I think that like, I mean, this isn't like exactly like a policy, but I actually think that like kind of convincing people sort of like, you know, about the numbers on a particular policy isn't always like, you know, what's required. I think that just like, you know, getting people to like view like density as like not a thing to be like
it's not a worst case scenario.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, I grew up in Seattle and in a particular neighborhood in Seattle that I now visit a lot is Ballard, and it's a neighborhood that you know 30 years ago it was not an attractive place to live, and then that has changed dramatically, and then it changed so much in the last 10 years. Like there was just this period, 5-year, 10-year period of dramatic construction, and like. Was
it infill, or was it sort of like, you know,
it was like changing the zoning. It was changing the zoning so that like now where there was once one house, there is now 4, right? And I like basically mean that. Like it's like where there was once one house, there is now
a fourplex
like
there now.
Like not a fourplex, but like three or four like very tall like independent like houses like on into like, you know, with lots subdivided so that like, you know, each person, there's not like a condo, right? And so I think that like those kind of creative policies, which isn't necessarily about like, you know, getting rid of exclusionary zoning, but it's just about sort of like kind of having an attitude toward like, you know, this is a pretty attractive place. It's proximate to downtown, like it's proximate to the things that people want to do. And so like, we're going to like really try to like.
Yeah. I mean, something that I talk about constantly is not only is density not bad, it's really good. Like it's like people are really attracted to walkable, dense spaces. I mean, you think about if you've ever been to Vail Resort and you walk around there, that's literally like Manhattan style density. And even though it's like not a real city, it's still a place that attracts people because of the way it's configured very densely. And
I mean, so getting back to sort of policies, like, I mean, I think that the other thing is sort of making sure that like when you are thinking about like your transportation policy, that like that is integrated with what some of your housing objectives are, right? And so like, you know, like in particular, like, I mean, this is about zoning, I guess, so maybe it's kind of all part of the same thing, but like, you know, making sure that like when you are, you know, thinking about like adding bus service, right, like here in Boulder, or, you know, maybe building a light rail if such a thing ever happens, that you do that alongside thinking about like where people will live and whether that is where they want to live, and then therefore whether the investments that you're going to make in transportation infrastructure sort of like are well synchronized with your housing objectives, right? And so I think like that's another way in which like, you know, I mean, it's sort of about zoning, but it's also sort of about thinking about like how people are going to do the things, how people are going to be mobile within the community that, you know, they want to live and that you want to maybe encourage them to live in.
Cool. Lost my train of thought. I've got a stack of like 4 questions I'm working on. So something you were saying, like you got into the second policy, then you were sort of like, well, it's not really a policy, it's more about people's attitudes, kind of. And it reminds me, something I wrote down when we spoke was this quote. You said, that the affordability issue, or just like housing land use in general, is not a problem of economics, but of people. You know, so it's like, what's the problem with people?
I wouldn't say it's a problem of any particular person.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've said a version of this earlier, but I'll kind of restate it as an answer to your question, which is that like, you know, I think like for me personally, that like one of my like hopes and dreams or whatever is to live in a like a dynamic society. And to live in a community that like reflects that broader society, right? And I think that like.
And are you emphasizing like like things are always changing, or do you just mean like there's just a variety of
that there is diversity, right? So I think that's one way that you get dynamism, diversity of like all types, like both demographic diversity, but then just like like people who are interested in different things, who come from different places, even though maybe they look similar, but then people who come from different places and don't look similar. I think that like that is like a kind of core value to me, and I think that means that like in like in an uneasy way that means that like implicitly that should mean that I'm willing to accept sort of more like uncertainty or kind of risk. Like I don't mean that in like a like something bad might happen to me necessarily, or like something like like I might get like robbed or whatever, just that like I think that like I'm like a dynamic society is one that is like kind of by definition like less predictable, right? And like I'm not going to get the benefit of that predictability, but I'm going to get the benefit of knowing that like sort of my society or the place where I am will be able to adapt, because we will be able to draw on like the different talents and experiences of a larger group of people, and like that is like core. And that just means that like I have to be willing to like live to like put up with some other stuff, right? Yeah. And like I'm not even sure that I could articulate what all that stuff is, but like I think I know that like that's okay, right? Like that like I'm willing to trade off like the dynamism for that stuff. Or I'm willing to get the dynamism instead of getting like the certainty.
I really appreciate that. And one of our goals with this podcast is sort of like, we want to breathe imagination into people's brains about like how the city could be better if we just, sort of let go of some of that certainty that we want by kind of trying to freeze everything. So we're filming this one day after the Raucous Caucus. So there was an event last night that hosted 10 potential candidates for city council. And one of the candidates that I really liked framed it that way as being like, Boulder's kind of stuck in this mindset of like we're trying to freeze what we have, so that we have like a predictable, ordered universe, and we just don't want it to change. And you give up a lot when you do that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that like you kind of don't notice it, right? That like unless something really dramatic happens, it's sort of like it changes over time in a way that like is almost imperceptible, right? And like that is maybe good, right? Because people kind of get used to it, but it's also bad because like there's this like depreciation of both like the physical and like the social capital of a location, that like especially I mean like the physical capital, like we can probably muster like the resources to rebuild that if we really wanted to. Like that's something that you don't get it for free, but it's sort of easier to imagine reconstituting it. But like the social capital that is much harder to reconstitute, right? Like a community, right, that like values the outdoors in the particular way that it does, and has been innovative in thinking about like how the outdoors can sort of like be integrated into the community. Like great, like we should take that and we should think about like how we're going to do that for for the next subsequent generations. And that need not mean like sort of like we'll just keep doing the same thing. I mean, it might mean that, but like what are the alternatives, and why have we decided that those are definitely worse? I mean, have we gone through that process, or have we sort of just gone through the process of saying like, yeah, well, this is pretty good, and like we're in charge, and so like let's just keep it that way.
So I love the way that you do this, because you talk in generalities and you literally wave your hands a little. So what I would love to do is just say here's a magic wand. What you're now an autocrat, and don't give me the academic generality. Like what would you risk your political fortunes on if you were in charge?
I mean, I think that like So I live in South Boulder, and like I imagine that this is not even close to a majority view, but I think that like, you know, I should be able to like subdivide my lot and tear down the house and build 2 houses, right? And barring that, like I should be able to like, not depending on like who else in my neighborhood has an ADU, but I should just be able to put an ADU in, like knowing that like that's fine, like, and right, not depending on like who else like has one in my neighborhood, right? Like I think that's the way it works, at least in parts of Boulder, is that like, you know, sort of like ADUs are allowed depending on like the current density of ADUs like totally, in some area, right? So that's one. I think just like taking and saying like, you know, South Boulder, like Veely Lake, it's like a great place to live, and like we should have more people who get to live there, right? And like I think that like that would definitely mean that like that community center or that rec center is more busy, that the park around it is busier, that Shanahan Ridge trails are a lot busier. And I just think that like, you know,
that's okay.
Onward we go, right?
It's better than having more commuters coming into town than, you know, having people living closer to where they work.
So I think that's something that would directly affect me in you know, in ways that would be like, I think, shocking to like, you know, probably even to me, like even though I'm the one saying the words. I think like shocking to me, but like let's do it. I think that rules about how many related people can live in the same house. I mean, right? Like we are a college town, and like we have like a set of housing rules that like almost are trying to pretend like we're not. And I think that like rules about like how many unrelated people can live together, like be gone.
Awesome. Like, I campaigned with the bedrooms are for people, folks, and that's sort of my crowd. You know? So
I mean, I think that those are 2 things that like, I mean, less so the second one would have a direct impact on me, right? That like I would be able to like, you know, I wouldn't like be making decisions where that would necessarily be, but the first one, I think, I mean, like there is a way in which like I think you could say like that would be worse, and like I think many people would say that would be worse, but I think like.
Yeah, one way I think about those streets near Veely Lake is, you know, that area probably looked really beautiful before it was developed over. And if you go to the bottom of where Shanahan, where Lehigh meets, I can't think of the Greenbrier, but Lehigh meets Greenbrier, and you look over the ranch to the south, how beautiful that is. And, you know, the thought of like paving that over for more suburban style single family homes with meandering streets that go nowhere is horrifying. Like I think there'd be like literally physical violence, but we don't really like stop to reflect on like, okay, but we did this just like 50 years ago, less than a century ago. We did that to this beautiful land that sits under NCARF, and can we like take stock of what we did to this land, and maybe, and I mean, obviously we're not going to like scrape it and try to return it to a prairie. But maybe we could just, you know, like I feel like if we collectively valued the land more, it would just be so much more efficiently used.
Yeah, I mean,
that's sort of how
I don't know. I mean, I think that you're right that like we're sort of like, let's like work within like, let's like improve, like before we go off like inventing like, you know, new like bringing new land into, you know, our human use or whatever, or like our residential like, you know, like bringing more land into like to serve like residential housing. Let's like think a little bit about how we're using like the current allocation. Totally. So that's so those are I think 2 practical things. I mean, I guess the other thing that I would say is that like, you know, I'm sort of like vaguely aware of so not like all the details, but like I get flyers and I read things here and there about like, you know, something like the development at CU South, right? Mm-hmm. Which the university owns and, you know, has some plans to do some stuff with, and you know. I think that like
it probably won't surprise you. I have strong opinions about that, but
yeah, and like you know, I'm not here to like evaluate, and nor do I know like a lot about like the very particular ways in which like things are going to be used and what's going to be done. But I think that like I know that there is kind of like polarized opinion around this, or at least that there is a stated strong opposition to some of what is proposed, and I just think that like that opposition has to live in the same world as like we also have the objective of like making houses affordable. And so I think that like I have that objective. I want houses to be more affordable, and that just means I think that like CU South, I mean, I'm not sure like how directly that contributes to like the housing affordability issue. I do know that like, or I do imagine, I guess, that like not developing it would make all of the houses in Martin Acres a lot more expensive. Like I sort of like it's not like a law of nature or something, but it's like almost that.
Yeah.
And so like I just and so I think that like we just need to not care about that stuff that is sort of like, sometimes it quite directly affects us, but oftentimes it's sort of like it can be sort of like a couple of degrees removed. And like I just think it's not your zone. Like you have these other objectives for Boulder to be affordable, for Boulder to be more inclusive and diverse, and like you having a say, or a person having a say over what's going on at CU South, I think is in pretty close tension with those other goals.
Yeah, definitely.
Affordability, diversity, and inclusion, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that is, those are kind of two like specific policies, and then one maybe sort of like attitudinal change.
Just give us the handles for them that you said. You said just kind of like you kind of gave like a modest zoning reform.
Yeah. So density,
the occupancy.
The occupancy. Yeah. And then sort of like less opposition to things that are pretty closely connected to affordability.
Yeah, totally. That's great. So we've gone for a little while, but I have this other theme that I want to raise if you have time, because my co-host isn't here with us, so I want to channel him for just a minute.
Okay.
Because what he likes to talk about is community land trusts specifically, but also more generally, just like are there ways to take the speculative land market out of the picture so that it's not, there's less incentive to drive up prices and to speculate and to have investors. And so I mean one of his answers is to have like an exchange program. You get to redevelop this lot and you get the profits from the development. In exchange, the land underneath it goes into a community land trust type arrangement. Or some other things. Our first conversation, you recommended this book, Radical Markets, which has chapter 2 is like this. It's really kind of like, the way I see it is like it's like a thought exercise, right? Like let's just say we did have the autocratic magic wand and we could just implement whatever we wanted, and so it's this thought exercise about property tax and self-assessing your property, with the caveat you have to be willing to sell it at that price, and how that would make things liquid.
So just to like give people a sense of what we're talking about here, I mean, I think so Glenn Weil and Eric Posner have this proposal in one of the chapters of their book Radical Markets, and I think like especially applied to an asset class like residential property. I think that like you should first think about it as a kind of thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this, which is that like everyone can name their price that they are willing to sell their house at today, right? And with you could imagine some kind of sort of like standard process for sort of like the timing of all of this, so that it's not
basic safeguards. You're not kicked out tomorrow if someone showed up.
But like sort of try to make it reasonable. But that like the idea is that like you announce the price that you're willing to sell at.
Everybody does.
Everyone does. And then you register that in somewhere so that it's sort of it's known. It's common information. And then, right, so then you want to prevent people from, so that kind of gives people stability, right? They can say, well, I don't want to move, so I'm going to announce a high price. Right, I have a high value for where I live now for whatever reason, so I have a high price. But then you want to sort of bound that by making sure that people can't just say infinity, right? And then we're roughly in the world that we live in right now.
You're taxed based on the.
And so then the idea is that you're taxed on this at sort of at something like the optimal rate, right? And then the question is, one, like, what is the optimal rate? And so in their book, they talk about sort of the optimal rate for any asset class being sort of, roughly speaking, the rate of turnover, right? So if I think the statistic they give is something like the average house in the U.S. turns over once every 12 years, right? So people move once every 12 years on average across the whole population. And so that would be the tax rate, right? So something like, what is it?
That's a ton of tax.
Like
that's a lot of tax, right?
In Boulder, right? Like, or in Colorado, like that's a gigantic, like that's like an 8-fold or like whatever, like it's a very big increase.
Yeah, there's a lot of $1 million homes. So like if you had $1 million home and it was at, what'd you say, 12%? That'd be $120,000 a year, $10,000 a month.
Yeah, right.
Okay, yes.
I mean, like the idea is that, like, of course, that,
it's
like,
a thought exercise.
That this would induce like people to lower the price that they're right. So like the idea is that there will be adjustment in the system.
Sure.
And so. Okay,
and
so
of course
so
that replaces a bunch of other taxes too.
Yeah.
Like that's like going to be a main tax.
Yeah. And so then the idea is that, like, this addresses like some economic problems, right? So on the one hand, you want to make sure that people have an incentive to invest and improve in their structure, right? That they will make the normal sort of improvements, right? But then on the other hand, you want to make sure that people sort of that kind of the right people, right? The people who do in fact have the best and highest value use of a particular piece of land, that they are the ones that are sort of allocated the land kind of through this mechanism. And so, like, that's a crazy thing, right? Like, we're not going to do this. Like, it's not going to happen. I mean, at least I think there would be, very strong opposition. I mean,
from the incumbents,
from lots of people who sort of like don't like the smell of this idea, and then probably even don't like the details like of the idea. But I don't think that like this is going to happen. But I do think that we can sort of use something like this as a kind of model for thinking about like smaller adjustments that we can make to the current system, right? So we're not going to, in Boulder or in Colorado, like raise the property tax like to the amount that would be equivalent to this tax, right? Like to the optimal tax. But like we do have low taxes, and perhaps maybe like this is a tool that we can sort of use if we think that we want to kind of make the allocation of land in a particular place more efficiently, right? We need not, and so maybe like we don't have to like have this whole like crazy system of like registering your land and being willing to like, people don't like that, but like maybe just like property taxes are a little bit higher, like that kind of mechanism. I mean, like people aren't going to like that because people don't like high taxes. I mean, like everyone, like across the spectrum, right? But I don't think that, I think that houses like values would fall, right? Sort of to kind of adjust for the fact that like now the tax is higher. And I do think that would be sort of like a pretty small step. I mean, you can make the increment in the tax increase as small or as big, but as small as you want it to be, to sort of start to move us in the direction where people sort of are thinking about like where they live as connected to like the particular piece of land that they occupy, and whether like they are the people to kind of steward that land into the future, right, for the kind of for future generations. Like I don't think we should like do anything radical like on this front. Like I think it wouldn't be popular, and and then as a result would not be feasible. But I think like sort of like taking that perspective and trying to do things that are sort of more within the normal bounds of like political psychology, like that would be useful.
Well, I mean, to me, it really points out, one of the problems is that owning land and owning property is not very expensive, right? Like it's not expensive to be wealthy. It's expensive to be rich, to have high income and to become wealthy. But once you're there, it's sort of like you can just sit on it. It kind of accumulates, yeah. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I mean, and then I think we're not just talking about in Boulder, we're talking about a kind of a housing market that isn't just designed to benefit incumbents or benefit people who work at Google or Facebook, right, or Twitter, or kind of the places like the big tech companies that are a little bit detached from this particular local economy, right? Like they're these massive global companies, but you want to make a city works best when it's not just kind of the people who are sort of doing the main thing you do in that city who can afford to live there, right? But that it's the people who are doing other things. Maybe people who are providing services to those people. Maybe they're high-end services. Maybe they're not high-end services, right? Yeah. And so I think a system, or kind of moving in the direction of Weil and Posner, or kind of going back in time to the late 19th century, Henry George. I don't think we're doing anything we don't want to do anything radical, and certainly there are radical. I mean, they say it, radical markets. But kind of using that intuition to sort of think about smaller changes to the system that would be palatable and acceptable.
The reason I rang the little bell is because David likes to talk about Henry George whenever he gets the chance. Thank you so much. I think this has been a really fascinating conversation.
Well, good.
I just want to give you one more opportunity for parting shots. You have anything you want to leave listeners with?
I mean, I think that I would like to reiterate something that I said maybe toward the beginning, which is just that I think that we would all expressively say, or many of us would expressively say, that we want to live at least maybe not not everyone would use the word dynamic, but a prosperous society. And I think housing is just a fundamental input into that. And that if you start caring about a lot of other stuff in this area, in particular what you are allowed or what your neighbor is not allowed to do with their housing, I think you start to sort of stand in the way of that prosperity. And I don't want to just emphasize that, because some people won't sort of the framing around sort of the economy.
It's all about the GDP
and GDP. I mean I think too that in the vast majority of communities in the US, that to be a diverse and inclusive community is to be a community in which the majority of people kind of picked out of the country could afford to live there, right? Because we don't think that it is necessarily, or we don't think that it is the case that talent, right, is allocated to people based on the income of their parents, right? That's not something that we think in general, right? Talent is out there, and it's not being utilized for a variety of reasons, right? Some of that has to do with discrimination, which this is not what this is about. But some of that, but some of that discrimination comes through the housing market, right? And then some of that is not, and some of what happens in the housing market is not discrimination per se, but it's just the unaffordability of housing structures in dynamic and productive cities in the U.S. Boulder wouldn't be the first city that I would name, but it would be on the list of places that is incredible that more people should get to share in.
Yeah, great. Nice closer. Thank you.
Yep.
This episode of Sharing Boulder was produced by David Adamson and Philip Ogren. Sound and video editing was done by Philip Ogren. The intro music was sampled from Osladum by Gilberto Gil and is available for use under the Creative Commons Sampling Plus license. Please visit us at sharingboulder.us for show notes and previous episodes.